Okay, this is section 3 or section 4, depending on what your notes say. I've updated these over the years, and I need to update my slides, but that's okay. We're still in the Cold War Expands. The title is the same, whatever your section number reads. It should be the Cold War Expands. Alright. We kind of mentioned this, I believe, in the last section, where we talked about the increase in military spending that really starts to ramp up in the 50s and 60s. But we haven't specifically spoke on it. So, communist advances shocked the nation. In September of 1949, instruments in an American B-29 bomber that was flying over Alaska detects an unusual amount of atmospheric radiation. That radiation cloud had drifted from Siberia. In case you don't remember where Siberia is, think Russia. It's right there by it. Scientists analyzed the data collected by the aircraft and reached the conclusion the Soviet Union had set off an atomic bomb. Up until this point, we were the only country that we knew of, and we were pretty confident we were the only country, period, that had figured out how to make atomic weapons. And so it does scare us quite a bit, and that's kind of the epitome of the Cold War, really, in and of itself, is us being nervous about what the Soviet Union is capable of doing and might do, and the Soviet Union being nervous about what we're capable of doing and might do. So we no longer have a monopoly on this type of weaponry. A month after learning this, or not even a month after learning this, about the Soviet Union's weaponry, the communist takeover was complete. Americans sense the world was a much more dangerous place than it had been before. 3 months before this, Truman ordered the Atomic Energy Commission to produce a hydrogen bomb. Someone asked me about this, I believe, during World War II. It was something we didn't have during World War II, but we developed it shortly after. So, H-bomb. It was predicted that the H-bomb would be 1,000 times as powerful as an atomic one. Scientists such as Oppenheimer and Einstein, who were instrumental in the Manhattan Project in creating the atomic bomb, opposed the creation of the H-bomb. They believed it would only lead to an arms race, and they were right. During the next 4 decades, the Soviets and the Americans developed and stockpiled an increasingly powerful nuclear weapons. And if you don't remember how World War I and World War II started, the fact that they became world wars, the stockpiling of weapons was a big factor in that. Both sides hope that this program of mutually assured destruction, though, meaning if one side starts it, the other side's going to be destroyed, they're both going to be destroyed, kind of a deal, would prevent either country from actually using a nuclear device. Still, though, the threat of nuclear destruction seemed to hang over the world like a dark cloud. Eisenhower initially accepted much of Truman's foreign policy. However, Eisenhower and his Secretary of State, John Foster Dulles, differed from Truman's foreign policy. So a lot of his foreign policy, he kind of, as he got more and more into his term, Eisenhower, started to kind of change his belief system. And you see that play out sort of right away in the Korean War when Eisenhower gets there. He is not afraid to threaten the use of atomic weaponry and be willing to threaten the use of military force, whereas Truman was a little more cautious. He didn't want to threaten atomic weaponry because he's the only president who's ever used it, and I think it kind of sobered him to that type of destruction, what it was capable of. Whereas Eisenhower's kind of a military guy, and so what he ends up kind of coining and bringing about during his term as president when it comes to foreign policy is something called brinkmanship. This is the belief that only by willing to go to the brink of war, so brinkmanship, could the United States actually prevent war from happening and protect itself and its allies. It's similar a little bit to Teddy Roosevelt's big stick diplomacy, which we talked about earlier this year. His idea of, try to work things out, try to do everything on paper and by the book and peacefully, but make sure the other side knows that you have a large military at your disposal and you are absolutely not afraid to use it. In 1954, Dulles announced the policy of massive retaliation. So this exact idea that the United States would respond to communist threats by threatening to use necessary force, and that necessary force could include and would include nuclear weapons. On March 5th, 1953, the Soviet leader Joseph Stalin dies. Nikita Khrushchev soon emerged as the new Soviet leader. Although still a communist, Khrushchev was a lot different, a lot less cruel and less suspicious than Stalin. I think that's kind of the understatement of the centuries. Joseph Stalin was one of the most paranoid and vicious tyrants, let's just call it what it was, that the world has ever seen. Led to the death of millions and millions and millions of his own people, let alone the war path he charted throughout World War II. But Nikita Khrushchev will take over him, but he's still not a fan of the United States and definitely a communist. He renounced several of Stalin's policies, though, and inched toward a more peaceful relationship with the West, because the world is changing, and I think he wanted to avoid war just like the United States did. In 1955, he met with Eisenhower Conference in Geneva, Switzerland, so that kind of showed that he was willing to try to avoid war, kind of a live and let live to an extent for Khrushchev. I like this chart on the right. It shows you our nuclear warhead production, which we kind of talked about on the previous slides. So how many we had, how many other countries had. These are all UN countries, by the way. And the years that they had them. So 45 into the Second World War, we're the only one that has any. We have 6. And then you can see that number very dramatically increase, and then the Soviet Union adding them. By 1950, their numbers increasing, but not at the same leap and bound that the United States' numbers are. Great Britain gets nuclear weapons in 1955, and then France and China are able to get nuclear production in their countries by 1965. People in countries such as Poland, Hungary, and Czechoslovakia resented the control exerted upon them by the Soviet Union. If you don't remember, at the end of World War II, these were countries that were quote-unquote liberated, and liberated with the help of the Soviet Union. And they ended up becoming not officially part of the Soviet Union, but what we would call satellite states. In 1956, 2 uprisings took place in Eastern Europe. Workers in Poland rioted and won greater control of their government, and then Hungarian students, which is what's on the cover here of the Time magazine on the right side of the slide. Hungarian students and workers organized protests demanding that the pro-Soviet Hungarian government be replaced. Soviet troops would be withdrawn, and that non-communist parties be organized. Khrushchev sent troops and tanks to crush the revolt in Hungary, and many of the revolution leaders were executed. Hundreds of others were killed. Eisenhower's massive retaliation approach was powerless here, and Americans could only watch as these events unfolded. We could not use force to give Hungary independence from the Soviet Union, sadly. We're going to watch some stuff about the Cold War and these couple of events, especially the events in Hungary, will be covered in that. So that's not the end of our talking about that, but I wanted to show you some footage from that. Same with the Suez Crisis. As the Cold War tensions increased, Egypt's president, Abdel Nasser, tried to use the Soviet and United States rivalry to his advantage, and he's not the only country that does that to an extent throughout the Cold War. Nasser wanted to construct a dam on the Nile River at Aswan, but the United States and Britain initially offered to fund the project, but when Nasser recognized the Communist People's Republic of China, which, remember, the United States was not officially recognizing this as China. The China that we recognized were basically refugees living on the island of Taiwan. We were not going to, call the People's Republic of China and trade with them and talk with them, and that's not what we wanted to do because we were supporting the nationalists in that civil war. So when Nasser basically starts taking and engaging offers from communist countries like China and the Soviet Union, Eisenhower says, well, okay, then we're not going to offer to fund your project if you're going to entertain the idea of taking money from a communist country and therefore becoming a communist country. Count the United States out. So Nasser nationalized the Suez Canal, which means he placed it under government control. This threatened the flow of oil from the Middle Eastern countries to Europe. It doesn't affect the United States too much yet. This is still a point in our history where we don't really rely on Middle Eastern oil, but it really affected Great Britain and France. And Great Britain and France really wanted to fix this crisis, and so Britain and France decided to use force to try to kind of figure out the Suez crisis, and as an excuse to seize control of the canal. Eisenhower is furious that they didn't talk to him about that first. They did not. They joined forces with Israel to try to get the canal back in the hands of Western nations. And instead of supporting them, he chose instead to criticize them and refused to supply them with U.S. oil while they tried to work out the Suez crisis and get oil from the Middle East like they had been all along. Israel, France, and Britain had counted on the United States supporting them. They had just assumed that we would, and so when it didn't come, they had to withdraw their troops from Egypt. And we'll watch some stuff on that later on. In response to the Soviet influence in the Middle East, which was something we were concerned about, Eisenhower made a statement in January of '57 that became known as the Eisenhower Doctrine. So another similarity here, a little bit, in my opinion, to Teddy Roosevelt. He announced that the United States would use force to help any Middle Eastern country that was threatened by communism. This doctrine is actually similar to the Truman Doctrine, where Truman says any European country that is trying to resist communism, if you want United States help, we will help you. Meaning mostly Western European, but it came to include a lot of places in Europe. And that's how we started sending money and things like that, due to the Truman Doctrine. Anyway, Eisenhower's administration also used something called the Central Intelligence Agency, or the CIA, which was pretty new in its struggle against communism. It was created in 1947 to gather intelligence only. Eisenhower kind of broadened the job description of the CIA, gave them a lot more meaningful role in government, and that role still exists today. Eisenhower approved covert operations to protect American interests all over the world with the CIA. In 1953, the CIA aided a coup to install a new government in Iran. In 1954, they did something similar in Guatemala. Both operations put non-communist governments in power, but they also created, unfortunately, long-term resentment toward the United States by both Iran and Guatemala. All right. Next slide. This map just shows you some hot spots during the Cold War, and it also shows you some alliances. So the yellow countries, those are NATO countries, or North Atlantic Treaty Organization countries. The red countries, it's kind of hard to see in Europe. Obviously, you can see the Soviet Union because it's huge. Those are Warsaw Pact countries. It doesn't show, well, it kind of does. So some of the green, like Australia, that would be considered a CETA country, which we talked about in the last section. And then, let's see. And then, like China, they are obviously an ally with the Soviet Union, but they're not technically in the Warsaw Pact. Alright, I believe this is the last slide for this section, and this is probably a slide that you're not going to enjoy. The Cold War blast off into space. We'll talk more about the space race in our next unit when we get to the 60s a little bit more, and Kennedy a little bit more. But I do want to mention it here because we really did start it in the 50s, and NASA was created as well. So I mention it here. We'll get into it a lot more when we get to the 60s. We'll kind of go backwards to go forwards when we get there, as it were. While the United States did manage to contain the spread of communism on the ground, they faced tremendous setbacks when it came to outer space. In October and November of 1957, in October, the Soviet Union launched 184-pound steel ball called Sputnik 1. It contained a transmitter, though, and they put it into orbit around the Earth. And then in November, this is the more notable one, they launched a similar satellite called Sputnik 2, carrying a small dog. And there it is on that picture on the right. That's Laika, the USSR Soviet space dog aboard Sputnik 2. And I will just go ahead and tell you the dog died in orbit because they had no way of getting it out of orbit in time. Yes, the Soviets killed a dog. I know, I'm upset about it too. Successful launches shocked many Americans who believed the United States had the upper hand on the Soviets in every phase of the Cold War. So the fact that they could put 2 satellites into orbit around the Earth scared us, and it made us kind of think of the worst possible conclusions. Did that mean they could launch missiles from space? Could they, just all the different things of what they could possibly do with this technology. So Congress quickly approved the National Defense Education Act, which was a $1 billion program intended to produce more scientists and science teachers, and they also created the National Aeronautics Space Administration, or NASA. Like I said, we'll talk more about the space race when we get to the 60s. As far as this section is concerned, I'm going to end it here. We'll wrap up the Cold War notes, not the Cold War, because that will take us all the way through the rest of the semester, basically. It doesn't end until 1991. But the Cold War notes, so the early part of the Cold War, I should say, we'll wrap that up in the next section, and then we will get to more of the culture of the 1950s in our chapter after that.